if you want to put stuff up here too.
I'll wait for you.
No, go ahead. If I can just use this for now.
I'm after you now. Come on.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I am John Grossman, and over here on my left and your right is my wife, Mary Lou Grossman. And we have the honor of welcoming you tonight. And I bring that welcome also on behalf of our pastor, Father Steve Bernowski, who can't be here tonight, and also fellow parishioners. And just want to say to you who are here, and it's also being live streamed to our guests who are with us live streaming, that we warmly welcome you to St. Hilary. We want tonight, as this local congregation, to particularly applaud the work of the Akron Area Interfaith Council and this three-part forum that is focused on current, existing anti-Semitic words, actions, violence. Mary Lou and I are also actively involved in what's called the Interfaith Justice Alliance. It is 4 congregations who, for the past 5 years, have been working together on building bridges as we focus on current social justice issues. And those 4 collaborating congregations are St. Hilary, Faith Lutheran next door, New Hope Baptist, and Temple Israel. Our topic for our March series, which happens every year, but this series on March 2023 on 4 Wednesday nights, is going to be, which is speakers and dialogue, is going to be on the topic, the tragedy of gun violence in our country. And it will be formally announced in January of this coming year. Tonight is part 3 of this current forum. The focus of our topic is anti-Semitism in Akron, in America, and particularly tonight, strength in numbers, what our interfaith community can do. It will be led by a distinguished panel of 4 leaders, and that panel in just a minute or two will be introduced to you by the Emeritus Dean of the University of Akron School of Law, Marty Belsky. But before that, I have one practical announcement, and that is that if you need a bathroom, the bathrooms are in the back of the church, the entranceway in from Market Street, right in that adjoining space behind you. And now I'd like to call on my wife, who's going to just offer us a brief prayer from our tradition, but I think you'll recognize the words, have heard them before. Mary Lou?
Good evening. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O God, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.
Thank you, Mary Lou, and Marty, it's all yours.
This is the third session. The first session we heard a little background in history. In the second session we heard the national agenda and what's been going on nationally as far as anti-Semitism. But for me, anti-Semitism is personal, so I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about why I think it's personal. I was born in North Philadelphia. I was raised in North Philadelphia. It was ethnically, religiously, and racially diverse. And we all seemed to get along until we reached about 13, 14, and then all the stereotypes came rolling in. And my father sat me down right before my bar mitzvah, age 13, and gave me what I call the talk. And I know similar groups have had that talk in other scenarios. And he says that you're going to have many slights because of your background and who you are. You're a Jew. Don't make too many waves. Don't bring shame. The phrase he used was shanda. Don't bring shame on us when you do that. On the other hand, he said, if you are too shy, you're going to get the stereotype that occurred before Israel of being a weak, sissy brainiac. How do you balance that? I did not like at that point being defined as the other. As I got older, I saw that definition worked again and again. What did it mean? What did that accent, what did that attitude mean? Our next door neighbor were the Schwartzes. He had escaped from Austria, and as I got older, I remember sitting down with the father, Michael Schwartz was my closest friend, and asking him, why did you stay so long in Austria? And he said, well, it wasn't going to happen to us. I mean, we were involved, and I had a major business. I didn't think anything was going to happen to us. And, and I was convinced that these little slights, these little sort of things that happen, these little itsy-bitsy things, were never going to multiply. Well, he left when it did. My first incident was in German class. I took German because my parents spoke Yiddish, and I wanted to know what they were saying. And we had a song, Aren't You Glad You're Not a Duck? Yes, I'm glad I'm not a duck. Ach du lieber, ach du lieber. And one of the phrases was, aren't you glad you're not a Jew? And I was a little bit shocked by that, and I went up to the German professor, Herr Werner, never forget that, his name, and I said to him, it really bothers me that you asked us to recite that phrase. He said, oh, well, don't worry about it. You have to remember the context of the times. And I said, yeah, right, the context of the times? Little thing we now call the Holocaust or Shoah. But he sort of didn't get it. He really sort of didn't get it. Another high school situation, I had a history teacher in those days who would require you to get up in homeroom, because I had him for homeroom as well. His nickname was Reverend Rhodes, and he would require you to get up and read verses from the New Testament. When I explained to him that I really didn't feel comfortable doing that, he looked at me like I was some strange animal. And the strange animal was that this person wasn't going along with the group. I had to balance the idea of making waves or standing up and again, being the outsider. And how many public events have you gone to, not in church, not in a synagogue, where all of a sudden there's a wonderful prayer, a wonderful discussion, and the last phrase, and we do this in the name of our Lord Jesus. And that's perfectly appropriate, but not in a public institution, and I was at a public school. I felt that. So how do I stand up? What do I do? Am I a shrinking Jew? Am I an assertive Jew? Oh, it can't happen now? It can't happen now? I'm not really sure about that. More recently, I went to a wedding. One of my favorite students, not at this school, another school, was a young woman, and I was pretty amazed that she invited me to come to her wedding. And the father walked over to me and said, I really, really, really like you. I really, really like what you've done for my daughter. My daughter adores you. It's just a pity that you're going to hell. What do? I should have said, I'll see you there, but I didn't have the courage to do that. I didn't have the courage to do that. I interviewed to be a college president in a small little community. I'll be glad to tell you privately what it was. The alumni recommended me, the faculty recommended me, the students recommended me. The chair of the Board of Trustees called me 2 days later and said, you know, I have to tell you this, some of us have a problem with your high-powered ethnic style. High-powered ethnic style. I don't really know exactly what that means, but I have a feeling I sort of do know what they want to read. And while I was in that same location, it had to be Tulsa, Oklahoma, another guy wrote legal fiction. And he had the nicest to mention me in his book, and I thought that was really great. So I actually read the book. And as I read the book, he had in there the phrase, you know, we had to Jew the price down. And I said to him, you know, don't you realize it's inappropriate? He said, oh, it's a compliment. Why should you be upset by that? It's a compliment that you negotiate strongly. And I said, I'm not really sure it's a compliment in that scenario. We had another teacher, a person who came to law school and spoke, a United States congressperson who came to the school and spoke, and he gets up and he makes the following comment: we live in a Christian nation. Everybody else are visitors. They're welcome guests, but they're only guests. And I walked up to him and I said, I don't consider myself to be a guest. I think I'm really a part of this community. You know, I really think that I'm very involved in what's going on. And he looked at me straight in the face. I'll be glad to tell you who it is later. And he said, well, I guess we're going to, Dean, that's what I was Dean then, I guess we're going to have to agree to disagree. I was the chair of ADL for the state and other community relations council and other involved with that. And we had an incident or another situation where a gasoline/grocery store had a series of stores, it was not in Ohio, stores all over this community. And an individual who was an observant Jew came to see me and he said, here's my problem. I want to be assistant manager at this store, but they're requiring me to work on Friday night and Saturday. And he said, and I can't do it. I can't be an assistant manager. So I went to see the person who was the head of the company, who I knew because he did interfaith work. And I looked at him and I said, well, wait a second. Do you ever require anybody to work on Sunday? Oh, well, we can't do that. And I said, why not? He said, well, because they have to be able to go to church. I didn't say a word for a long time. And finally, I think he got it. He sort of understands that. My daughter, who now does stand-up comedy, was in the chorus in high school. And as part of the chorus, they have a Christmas holiday celebration. And part of the holiday celebration was to sing Christmas carols. And she said to the choir master, okay, I want you to know that some of the songs I'm going to mouth. I'm not going to say, because I feel uncomfortable with some of the explicitly religious songs that you're asking me to do. I'm not going to embarrass you. I'm just going to mouth them. I'm just not going to sort of sing them, okay? And the choir master said, well, if you don't sing them, you're going to flunk this course, and I'm going to take you to the principal. Rules are rules. And I went to see the principal on my daughter's behalf, and the principal said to the teacher, tell me why you did that. He said, well, he actually used this phrase again, and it's relatively recently. She has to recognize her place. This is a Christian nation, and we're going to sing songs on Christmas. And it's really wrong of her to try to say that she's somebody who can't sing those songs in that scenario, okay? That's our day of worship. That's our scenario. We want you to participate, and if you can't participate, then maybe she doesn't belong in the chorus. The principal, thank God, realized that that was wrong and reversed it, and reversed that attitude and that perspective. My final story, which happened less than 4 months ago, I was giving a talk at a church, I did some talks on the Old Testament. You guys call it the Old Testament. I call it the Scriptures. And I was talking about a situation like that. And after it was over, they came up and talked to me how different the New Testament was from, they call the Old Testament. And we started a conversation, and how I realized this person who has been studying the Bible, I thought, and I said to him, you do know that Jesus was Jewish, right? He looked at me and said, no, that's ridiculous. Jesus was Jewish? Jesus was Jewish? Absolutely the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Well, how do you respond to that person? It's very hard to respond to that person. Now, these are nits. These are little itsy-bitsy things. But these itsy-bitsy things build up over time, and who knows what happens as these things occur. When people sort of indicate what kind of a nation you live in, when people indicate what you should do or not do, over time, those things build up. Jonathan Goldblatt, who is the head of ADL, wrote a book, an answer to the book, It Can't Happen Here, and his book was, It Can Happen Here. We need your help, whether you're Jewish or whether you're not Jewish, to be able to sort of handle anti-Semitism, starting as insensitivity, sometimes with overt action, and perhaps violence in some circumstances. Our first speaker is Daniel Blaine. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the JCBA, Jewish Community Board of Akron. For some people who come from different parts of this country, that's the equivalent of the Jewish Federation. He leads the Jewish community's efforts to preserve, perpetuate, and enhance Jewish life. He has an amazing background and experience on Jewish issues and working in Cleveland and other places. I'm not going to go into great detail about it. Please go on the website of the JCBA and you'll find much more detail from that. I'll ask Daniel to come up here and make his comments.
Marty, thank you. And I want to thank the people who've been involved in planning, organizing this forum. It's really very meaningful what you're doing. And the fact that this even exists is a strong statement that as a Jewish community, we have friends, we have allies, we have people who care. So thank you. This past May, my father passed away at age 94. My dad, Mike Blaine, was born in 1928 in Czechoslovakia, in a small village. And when he was 14, think about when you were 14, when he was 14, he went from that small village by himself to Budapest, where he became an apprentice in leatherworks. That decision saved his life. In 1944, the Nazis swept through the village where he lived, gathering up the Jews to send them to Auschwitz. And that's where my father's mother, 3 of his sisters, and 3 nephews died. So I bring this up in part for some context and understanding of me, but also with some hesitation. Many, if not most, American Jews lost family in the Holocaust, which truly was the seminal tragic event in what's been a pretty rough history. But having said that, I want to avoid getting into what sometimes is called comparative victimology. In the past 100 years, there's a long and familiar list of genocide. Armenia, Cambodia, Rwanda, Darfur. Turn the clock back another 100 years, and you can add Native Americans and African Americans to that list. There's a lot written about the causes and process of genocide, which is generally linked to wars or economic crisis, autocratic and charismatic leaders, the dehumanization, scapegoating, and stereotyping of victims, tribalism and nationalism, groupthink, and the power of the mob. In other words, there are ample modern examples of how and why hate speech against any group can lead to the most tragic of endings. Hate anywhere is hate everywhere. I used to think America was different, much as Marty was saying. Democratic, rooted in law and institutions, pluralistic, enlightened. I'm much less optimistic now. The current economic and political climate in America, coupled with the amount of military-grade weaponry in the hands of civilians, certainly raises the potential. We've seen countless deadly attacks in recent years on synagogues, mosques, and churches, Blacks and Latinos, immigrant communities, governmental institutions, and the LGBT community. Hate can lead to extremely dark and dangerous places. So where does that take us? What is it we can do as a community? I'm going to share 3 thoughts. None of them are that original, but I do think all of them could have an impact. So the first is to be vigilant and vocal. We need to call out anti-Semitism and other isms as they happen, regardless of the source, and come to the defense of those being victimized. It is much easier to default to silence. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, the ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over that by the good people. And at the same time, we need to be careful about how we do this, especially when ignorance or stupidity are at play, and often they are. Adults generally don't respond well to being put in timeout. The second area is education. While forums like this are very constructive and appreciated, it's critical that we help children at a young age understand the dangers of hate. It's much more difficult to change an adult's perspective than to get it right the first time. An important component of this education is helping people understand that this isn't only about skin color or appearance. While Jews come in all colors, especially in Israel, most Jews in America are white and blend in with the larger population. America's been good for the Jews. We are a highly educated community with many who have achieved significant professional and economic success. And yes, there are a lot of Jews in places like Hollywood and hospitals, law firms and courtrooms, the halls of universities and government, all of which only provides fuel for anti-Semites and conspiracy theorists. Finally, build coalitions, much like the AAIC does. In the United States, minorities have become the new majority, which means there's a great deal of potential if we could harness and leverage the strength of bringing different groups together. This was one reason why the Kanye West episode was so disturbing to many of us. Blacks and Jews have much more to gain working together than by dividing and scapegoating. Conversely, a positive example in Akron is the longstanding Muslim and Jewish dialogue co-convened by Temple Israel and the Islamic Society. Finally, I want to share a few thoughts on the intersection between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. To be clear, at times Israel, like other countries, merits criticism. However, when Israel is disproportionately singled out while ignoring what happens elsewhere, a line is crossed. When Jews are verbally or physically harassed, or Jewish institutions and houses of worship are vandalized in response to actions of the state of Israel, that's anti-Semitism. When critics of Israel use anti-Semitic ideas about Jewish power or greed, utilize Holocaust denial, or claim that Israelis are committing genocide and ethnic cleansing, otherwise legitimate critiques also cross that line. Our collective challenge only gets more difficult when these claims are promulgated on social media by celebrities like Kanye West, Kyrie Irving, the Hadid sisters, Roger Waters, and Dua Lipa, just to name a few, who collectively have hundreds of millions of followers on social media, most of whom don't have the context, don't have the experience to understand and evaluate what they read and see. So, at the risk of that being too much of a downer, and it is tempting to kind of lose hope, throw up your arms, and walk away, I'm reminded about a passage from the Jewish text Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers. You are not required to finish your work, neither are you permitted to desist from it. Thank you for your support, your partnership, and your friendship.
Our next speaker is the Reverend Nanette Pitt. She's the pastor of First Congregational Church of Akron. She is a scholar, and she has worked on the issues of transnational studies and theology with a strong emphasis I'm glad to hear about it, on social justice and gender studies. And she was raised in South Africa, and so her awareness of oppression came about at a very young age. She is a key leader in Akron, advocating for racial justice and all forms of justice, including being worked on the most recently passed Issue 10 on police reform. Let's welcome Reverend Pitt, please.
I wasn't sure what to expect this evening, and the stage has certainly been set. I'm very appreciative, Professor Belsky, of your laying out such a personal perspective at the beginning of this evening. I think that it brought a great deal of depth to our conversation, seconded, of course, by your sharing, Daniel. Thank you. And I would want to just honor the depth of experience that sits behind the vignettes that you shared and the perspectives you brought and the lived emotional reality. And while we can stand here as allied with you, it is not the road we walk for many of us, and allyship requires that we stand alongside, but I think always honor the experience. And so I'm humbled to have been invited to speak and to sit alongside some, I hope, new friends here up front. I speak, of course, from a Christian perspective. I'm a Protestant pastor, and of the 20th senior pastor of my church, the first female and first immigrant for my congregation. And so that brings with it its own interesting perspective. And I never keep quiet, so they probably have had their fill of me long ago, but the firsts keep coming, so we keep pushing forward, and the congregation has remained a downtown urban congregation because of its desire to remain relevant in ministry in Akron, and so I'm also humbled to represent First Congregational Church this evening and to be here on their behalf to speak with you. I think for me, when I think of how the community can be present and what I aim to try to achieve within my ministry as a Christian pastor, is to bring a recognition, and I think it's what we all might do, of how anti-Semitism is woven into what we like to call the Judeo-Christian worldview. But I think really in this era of America's history, I think that word, when it's used, when that term is used like that, it makes Christians comfortable. And I think that it is a particularly, it verges on being slightly co-opting. I mean, there is a way to apply it in its best sense, but I think often Christians do that in a similar way to the way we've co-opted, from our view, quite a bit of Judaism. Professor Belsky referred to Old Testament, and I'll come back to that idea. But anti-Semitism is deeply woven into this nation and others' worldview of the sort of religious or socio-religious context of our cultures. And I think we don't see it. We're like Ted Lasso's goldfish. We swim around the bowl and we sort of have a short-term memory, and by the time we get around, we're like, oh, everything's new again. And it's the water that we're swimming in, and we don't, it's convenient to us. And again, many of us have, in the last few years, I hope, been reading a lot of books on white privilege, and I think it's another privilege. It's a Christian privilege to be able to assume certain things and not have to critique certain things. We get to set our blinkers, if you like. Anti-Semitism in that sense has been naturalized within the Christian context, and I think within the American context in particular. And again, I say that with an accent as a South African, and certainly we're speaking of America tonight, but I don't say that at the exclusion of other cultural contexts by any means, but that's not our purview this evening. I think that we also have forgotten, and we find it very hard, particularly as white people in America, to find a way to continue to account for the harm that was done by prior generations. It becomes a lot of what we name as white guilt, but we have a hard time knowing what to do with the pain of the past. Pain often that our forebears inflicted. In other words, particularly European, white, Christian forebears inflicted. And so the way in which anti-Semitism continues to be promulgated, I think, leads us to we sort of get caught in a system where we don't critique the past and we don't remember. We don't want to remember the pogroms. We don't want to remember the Holocaust in a real way, or what necessarily our forebears' part was in that. We want to remember how America stepped in at the right time. We want to remember how the Allied forces, we don't want to remember the awkward parts of any of either the First or Second World Wars, or even what led to that in the years before, and what has come after in different parts of the world, and specifically here. And we don't want to account for the ways that, and it's hard for us to see our history thousands of years through, right? But we don't want to account for how, in the Christian sense, this modern history was built out of often a Christian sense of holding Jewish people accountable for crimes against God, namely killing Jesus Christ. And I think even to some extent it might be arguable that that itself was the outcome of a bias earlier and a convenient way to blame and punish. So one of the ways that I deal with this in my setting, and I'm going a little out of order here in my notes, but one of the ways that we, I feel, in the Christian tradition can deal with this is by thinking and critiquing the way in which we naturalize things. So the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written in a different order from the way they appear in most scriptures in the New Testament. And John was the one written latest, right? 120 years probably, we think, after the death of Jesus. And for those of you who are really familiar with your scripture, you'll know that it's the one that is most vociferous. It's the one that uses the Jews the most. Because it's the one that is furthest from recognizing Jesus as a part, and the believers themselves as part of the local synagogues, as Jewish. So when we get to Easter and Holy Week, we use a lot of John depending on the lectionary cycle, and often on Good Friday, if you do the Stations, or if you do the 7 Last Words, or if you do Tenebrae, you're picking Christian scriptures and relying heavily on those narratives that will pull out a lot of the Jews. How does it affect the ears of our congregations in this day and age to hear that repeated year after year after year as we grow up? And we don't necessarily hold ourselves to account for that. We say things that are convenient, like, oh, that's just our tradition. We understand that it's not that way, you know. But we don't, we will say those things only if pushed, but in our worship services we'll continue to use terms like the Jews, equating the Jews of 2,000 odd years ago to Jewish people nowadays, when those are completely different groups of people. So I wanted to share with you a note that I use in my bulletins, and I'm happy to share this with you if you would like to share it with your congregations. I'd like to read it to you. It comes from a church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the first church in Cambridge Congregational, which is one of the oldest congregational churches in the country. A note on Holy Week, scriptural references to the Jews. This is printed in the order of service, mind you. We acknowledge the burden of the Christian Church's sad and violent history of anti-Semitism in the sobering shadow of the Holocaust and with the painful awareness of current events in Israel-Palestine. It is important to us to be clear about what our sacred texts mean when we refer to the Jews, especially during Holy Week when we contemplate Jesus' death. It may be helpful to recall the cultural context of our Christian scriptures emerging as they did from a small, originally Jewish community of believers in Jesus who, for reasons of faith in him as the Messiah, were eventually put out of the synagogues, John 9, verses 19 to 23, their places of worship. In John's usage especially, the Jews functions as a technical term for those among the people who did not accept Jesus as Messiah. It is a term that reflects the growing antagonism and the mutual recriminations that developed in the latter part of the first century between church and synagogue. The Gospel's use of the term the Jews should never be understood, therefore, as a blanket condemnation of Jewish people in particular or in general. And when the crucifixion narratives speak of the chief priests and the leaders of the people, these are also never to be identified with the Jewish people or leadership as a whole, past or present. It is one of the bitter ironies that the sacred texts of a beleaguered minority have been used to justify the subsequent persecution of the covenant people who were and are forever God's first love. Why, in heaven's name, do we call it the Old Testament? How unbelievably insulting is it that we co-opted someone else's scriptures and have the audacity to call them the Old Testament? Because yes, we believe Jesus came and brought a new and concluding word. That is our faith. How dare we hold someone else's sacred text and call it old? That's my taking your sacred object and naming it as bygone, as irrelevant in its very nature, in its very context. I am belittling. I would suggest that we would do well to only ever and for all time refer to it as the Hebrew Scriptures and invite our parishes, our churches, our congregations, our pastors, clergy, and leaders to do the same. We need always to be cautious about the ways that anti-Semitism has and is being ideologically used. We need to grow in our awareness about how we can so easily, so innocently, and I do believe it is innocent because it is not our intention, support ideas that when we face them and we think about them on balance, objectively, we're horrified. It's not what we mean to do. It's not our intention. So let us all resolve, individually and collectively, to match our intention with our actions and to invite others to do the same. I would add to what has come before and what I've said that we need to grow in our awareness of how anti-Semitism is being used ideologically to support ideas and ideologies of white supremacy that would also horrify us when we look at them full face and for all that they are. But often it's easy for us not to recognize them in small and insinuated ways. Many of us can harbor ideas, concepts, and language without realizing what they all add up to. So it's like holding on to just one of the pieces of straw, knowing full well that it's the last one that would break the camel's back. But if we're only ever holding one, we don't ever need to hold ourselves to account for the camel's back being broken. And yet we do really, because systems of oppression don't come from nowhere. Panels like this are so important. Hate is real, and it's built up from all of those little pieces of straw being carried, even forgotten, in a backpack or in the luggage that we carry each and every day. So friends, while we may not need to, each one of us would do well to open our suitcases, dust off our luggage, and make sure that we're not carrying things we don't intend to have with us, to call ourselves to account. And so I thank you again for being here tonight, for listening, and I look forward to talking more during the Q&A. Thank you.
Before we do Q&A, our final speaker, last but of course not least, is Dr. Joanna, I'm mispronouncing it, I'm sure, Castiglia? Close enough? Castiglia, sorry about that. She is a Dominican Sister of Peace. Just put my glasses on. Living in Akron. She's a professor at Kent State University. She currently directs the Building the Next Generation of Peace Leaders, which gives meaningful opportunities for students to share their words with other young people regarding issues of social justice and healing. Caniglia, Dr. Joanne Caniglia, please welcome her for our final speaker.
Thank you, and I am so honored to be a part of this panel, and I am so grateful. I'm going to be speaking in terms of two of my roles. First, as a Dominican Sister of Peace, and second, as an educator. First, the Dominican Sisters of Peace, every 6 years, create direction statements that lead us to read the signs of the times. And this is the direction statement, this is one of the first ones. It says, called by the Spirit and formed as women of the church within the vibrant tradition of the Order of Preachers, the Dominican Sisters of Peace, with our associates, embrace the following direction statement. Love impels us to foster and create cultures of inclusion. It is the first and one of the most important of our direction statements. I'm so proud of that direction statement. And now, as an educator. As a math educator at Kent State University, one would think that there really is no place in the math curriculum for discussing anti-Semitism. It should be in social studies, peace initiatives across campus. But in a math class, students have actually told me that, and I have said, yes, it belongs. It must be in the math classroom. It must be in every classroom. Every classroom must be a safe place. Teachers have a responsibility to keep their classrooms safe. One of my students actually told me, I really don't know what I'm going to do if something ever happens in my class like that. I told him in no uncertain terms, I said, please, please, never, always stop it. Always take a stance. You are their voice. And for example, in the math classroom, let me just give you an example of a wonderful problem. Think of the math here. PBS NewsHour recently said that the growth in anti-Semitism was 2,717 anti-Semitic incidents, a 34% increase from 2020. That means 7 anti-Semitic incidences every day. You do the math, and it's real. And then UNESCO, I think, as the UN, I go to UNESCO often, as the UN education, as the education branch of the United Nations. They have 3 suggestions, and all are very relevant. First, to recognize anti-Semitism as a problem to be addressed. There is a beautiful website, and it's included on a page of resources that I have over there at the table. It started with words. It's the name of the website. It's a website showing the impact of words to violence and hatred. You may not want to go against the crowd, but speak out with people who do call out hate speech. Never let it go. Second, to develop, this is UNESCO, second, to develop education programs that address anti-Semitism in a framework of human rights and global citizenship. We are so fortunate in Northeast Ohio to have the Maltz Museum. The Maltz Museum is a wonderful place, but mostly, and that's also listed on the resources, mostly it gives students of all ages, but students an opportunity to express their social justice activism in terms of like an essay contest. It is truly a wonderful place. And third, UNESCO says to build the capacity of educational systems to address anti-Semitism, conspiracy theories, and all other forms of hate speech. Today, coming to Kent, the Ohio legislature, I heard on NPR that the Ohio legislature would like to vote on giving the governor more determination of what is taught in schools, namely to do away with some of the curriculum that gives diversity voice. So most certainly speak out. And finally, Akron's efforts. One of my most wonderful opportunities as a math educator at Kent State is to work with different groups, and especially the Akron Public Schools. I'm honored to be working with so many of the teachers and administrators. First, Hillel and Kent State and also the University of Akron. I have visited those places often because my students have invited me. They provide friendship and accessibility for Jewish students on campus. One of the concerns that many students from Akron go to Kent, they sort of like work together, and in large part because there are only, when you look at the campus and the Hillel websites, there really are only 2 courses at the University of Akron for Jewish studies. And there really are not a lot of full-time faculty who are dedicated to those studies. How about Akron schools? The Board of Education, a good colleague of mine is Carla Chapman, who is the Director of Diversity now, the Executive Director of Diversity for Akron Public Schools. The Board of Education in Akron is committed to preparing each child for success. They actually have a policy on their books, and they have a comprehensive kind of a program in which everything is included. That's not to say one thing over the other, but that every student, and they say, and I quote, "The board believes that the responsibility for student success is broadly shared by district staff, families, our community, and our students' own efforts. It is the obligation of the district to embrace the diversity within our district while actively eliminating practices that perpetuate the disparities among our students, so that all students have the opportunity to benefit equally. They have a wonderful training of staff program that's building wide, so that they go around to each of the sites and perpetuate these wonderful programs with it. It's very comprehensive. It covers almost everything. And one of the things that I am most proud of in terms of Akron is at a time when political debates are swirling in Ohio about school curriculum and the role of schools in teaching controversial subjects, the Akron Public Schools Administration recommended new English and reading curriculums for K-12 students that put equity and diversity front and center. When all of the speakers today spoke about how important these words were, very much from their beginnings, from their 14 years old, it is essential that we start in the schools. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for Q&A. Let me explain what's going to happen. We hope you'll come to the mic if you have a question, and then direct it to whichever person you want to direct it to, and we'll try to file it off. We have a hand mic for them to pass among each other, and whoever gets the question will do it. I just will take the liberty to make 2 points when wearing my legal hat for a second. I don't know if you know this, but after World War II, one of the things that there was a number of individuals trying to do in the United States was to enhance some anti-Semitism by saying that the Jews are a race, which is what Hitler defined Jews as a race as well as a religion. And of course, the Jews picked it up and said, okay, if we're a race, we're entitled to certain privileges, certain immunities. And he actually went to court in a case called Share Tefillah, and the United States Supreme Court said, for the purposes of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, so you should have listened, we're going to declare Arabs and Jews to be racist. Okay, that's the first issue. The second thing I want to mention was that growing up, when we talk about Judeo-Christian, one of my mentors indicated that he called that hyphenated Judaism rather than Judaism, that part of that. And we're moving away from that by now talking a little bit more about the Abrahamic tradition and what's happening from that. And thank you for the plug for Hillel. I'm on their board and I'm the advisor at Akron, and you're right, we need to do more at Akron. We need to do much more at Akron. So those are my pithy comments, or lack thereof. So now, anybody wants to come up forward, please, and ask a question? They don't want to hear questions from me, so come up here and ask a question. Somebody, anybody. Yeah, go up and just to the mic. Go up to the mic here.
To combat anti-Semitism, it is important to define it. And ironically, it's hard to define. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, over a several-year period, reached a definition which is kind of verbose, but it's controversial. Nonetheless, it's been accepted by the United States government. Many countries, although a small minority of the countries of the world, and states and other organizations, and it's still being debated, including the latest example is many groups have come to Elon Musk and Twitter asking him to accept this definition for whatever moderation or lack of moderation he's going to have in Twitter in the future. But the controversial part for many people is that, as Daniel mentioned, it explicitly calls out anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. Of course, this requires a definition of Zionism, and the accepted definition by most Jewish people is the right of self-determination and nationhood to the Jewish people in the land of their ancestry. This, however, is under attack, mostly from the progressive left of the political spectrum, and the most vile descriptors that people of far left persuasion can think of to call a person now is Zionist, or a colonializer, or apartheid, or genocide proponent, all of which are attributes assigned to Israel. there's an epidemic of this sort of rhetoric on college campuses, which kind of flies in the face of the all we need is more education concept, because the leading college campus in anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist acts in the last year was Harvard University. And most of the Ivy League and Berkeley and University of Chicago and institutions of that ilk are very high on the list, as compiled by many organizations, including the ADL. There are also mainstream denominations in the United States that have had resolutions recently passed by their national councils that are anti-Zionist and have been decried by the American Jewish Committee and others. So my question, given all that, is it not time for liberal and progressive-minded people to stop putting all the emphasis on anti-Semitism on the white nationalist, Nazi sympathizer element of the far right, which nonetheless is very prevalent, but to focus maybe more on their political allies, perhaps, on the political left, and what that's doing to our youth, our colleges, our media, and the general standing of Israel in the world.
Anybody want to comment on that?
I had a note here, but I ran out of time because I read the other piece. But I think we could do a whole nother session, and I wish we would. And I would love to be a partner in Akron for a conversation that holds nuance around Zionism / the state of Israel and anti-Semitism, because I think that I'm not answering your question perhaps in the way that you want. So I represent the church on the left, which has a lot of political people who are very liberal on the left. I've been to Israel once, and I visited Israel in 2012, so 10 years ago now this year, and I promised myself I'd go back. I wanted to take every single person I knew back. I think it's a wonderful place to go, and it feels and smells like South Africa. Did you know that? The bougainvilleas and it just is very similar. So it was a wonderful trip for me. I went with a group that had a Muslim Palestinian guide and a Jewish Israeli guide, and there were some parts of, I can't remember, A and B that we went into where one of the other couldn't go, you know. So it was a nuanced trip, and we went to visit a Jewish woman in a village that was regularly shelled from the West Bank, and heard her story, and we went into Silwan and many other places, Bethlehem and obviously Jerusalem, and we didn't just do the Christian trip. And I sat on the pavement in Silwan outside of Jerusalem, and I burst into tears on a trip where I was not with people who I wanted to be crying around. And I tried to do it privately on my own, and there were some folk wandering up and down the street, which made me feel very self-conscious, but I cried because I'm a South African. And I never wanted to see that kind of division happening in my lifetime again. Those are people's lives. And there's a lack of humanity, and it's destructive, and it's horrific. And as a world, we should not be standing by. It should not be happening, and it's not okay. But it doesn't make sense, to your point, for us to not account for the ways that our rhetoric around those issues is reductionist and then supports things that we, on the other side, don't want to support either. And I think we need to find ways of having more robust conversation And I think that when we want to critique leaders or governments or administrations for making decisions, for the actions of some, we just need to not be having those conversations in reductionist ways. But that takes relationship, because we all built just a little bit of trust. We're strangers to one another. And I'll leave this place knowing that if I see one of these two people again, or your faces who I recognized and saw nodding, I'll be like, hey, I see you. I know you. Like, I already felt that way. I was like, some of the AAIC people coming in tonight, like, you're safe to me, right? And I'm safe to you. We know each other. We build relationship. And then perhaps we can have these difficult conversations. But if we're shouting at each other, if we're lobbing bombs at each other, if we're, So I don't have any answers, really. But it's both and for me, to be honest, because I can't accept what's happening in Israel, Palestine. I can't. It's not okay. But I don't want to have the conversation. I would be horrified if my words or my stance on it were to aggravate and inflame anti-Semitism. Horrified. And so I've been more silent than I would want to be, because I struggle to find the ways I can possibly even have that conversation.
Anybody else want to comment?
First, I appreciate your honesty. That's very important. And my answer to your question is yes. And I want to give a specific example of what comes to mind for me. And that's kind of a new movement towards intersectionality. Has anyone heard that term? So, and the idea there is, if you're really with us, you can't also be a supporter of Israel. And that's played out in the Black Lives Matter movement, and it plays out in LGBT groups where Jewish allies and supporters are told they can't participate because of Israel and their support of Israel. And besides it being incredibly twisted, I just got back from Israel, and walking around Tel Aviv, I saw rainbow flags, I saw men and women holding hands. It is a very progressive community, perhaps more so than some other places in Israel. And there's an annual Pride Parade in Tel Aviv, which is a huge thing. To think that somehow that's the evil empire, but yet try doing any of those things in most of Israel's neighboring countries, and you're not going to come back to talk about it. So it's a great example of, I think, a double standard and kind of a collision of issues that really shouldn't be brought together.
Any other comments? Any other questions? John, wait, John first, and then Reverend Beatty?
Yes. I struggle, like Reverend Nanette Pitt, because I have friends like you, Marty, who are Jewish, who I admire, respect, and love from the depths of my heart. And I have Palestinians who I respect, admire, and love from the depths of my heart. And I struggle with, one time I was at the Jewish Center here in Akron at an exercise class. And in my maybe stupid, self-righteous impulse, I mentioned something in favor of the Palestinians. Immediately, one of my former friends condemn me on the spot. And I had no rejoinder. He went so far as to talk to his rabbi here in Akron. And the rabbi wrote a hit letter naming me in the Akron Beacon Journal. I guess, I'm not sure what he accused me of, but I think it was being anti-Semitic. I guess we all say we're anti-racist. I'm not a racist. And tonight, Reverend Pitt has informed me of something I had failed to realize. But I think my Protestant pastor had recognized this when he refers, when there's, quote, an Old Testament lection, the Jewish scriptures. And I'm proud of my pastor for saying that. It didn't dawn on me that saying Old Covenant and New Covenant. And I'm so proud of my wife because we've made a practice when we send Hanukkah greetings to Marty and other friends. We use Jewish stamps, not Christian stamps. And we had a little argument yesterday about what kind of stamps, and we had bought so many stamps that we've individually funded the post office. And we had more Christian stamps we could think of. And they were really Catholic stamps. But it was, it was historical. And I said, well, why don't we just send the Christian stamps on our letters celebrating Hanukkah to our Jewish friends? Because it's historical. Well, it even has gone to the point where my wife is concerned about sending pictures of our Jewish Lord, Jesus, who Christians consider as Messiah. My wife is hesitant about sending a picture of the Catholic stamp to our own kids, 3 of whom are black and 1 is white. And I struggle because I know right now the Christian nationalists in our society are condemning the woke culture, which takes advantage of our history, good and bad. So we have one party that seems to be lining up against the woke culture. I am afraid for my Jewish friends in this atmosphere where anti-Semitism is promoted by the highest politicians at one time in the land, and violent people are attacking synagogues. On the other hand, I know my Palestinian friends are suffering in what they call their homeland, where at one time Jews and Christians and Muslims who were Palestinian lived together in relative peace. But now there is oppression and apartheid in Israel, and where the facts on the ground have basically made it impossible for a two-state solution. And I felt so uncomfortable when I returned to the Jewish Center on White Pond and met a dear friend who is Jewish, and sat with her through a presentation of invitation for really recruitment of American citizens to come to Israel. Absolutely. I'm sorry for talking too long. I just want to share my struggle to understand and to love both of my Jewish friends and my Palestinian friends. Thank
John,
you.
let's get somebody else to sort of, anybody else have a quick comment over there? And then I have a question to ask the panelists, a little bit more focused, if I can.
My name is Eileen. I don't have a question. I just would like to share, we have come a long way. I want to understand that this is really important, and I applaud everyone. I applaud this entire series. I want to share where I was in 1960 as a college student going into the dorm, and my first roommate was a convent dropout. I don't know if that's the right term, but pretty much. So along with her missal and her rosary, she chose the top bunk, and she had never met a Jew before. And so the power and just the thought of me being an example for the whole Jewish community is so frightening to me. I was scared to death. But as I'm laying there at night, and she had finished her prayers, and the rosary beads always dropped down to the floor past my bunk, I kept thinking, you know, the best way for her to learn is to come with me to services. So I asked her, and she said, well, now remember, this is 1960, I have to ask the priest. So she said, come along. So along I went to the rectory, where I sat out in the hallway while she went in and came out and said, I'm so disappointed I cannot go to your service. And I was dumbfounded. And she said, Father says that there's a temptation to change your faith by coming to your service. So I want you all to know, and you to know, that we have come a long, long way. It is not all bad news. This is a wonderful, wonderful opportunity for all of us to learn.
And if you go back even 30 years before that, we had Father Coughlin.
Yes.
During, that scenario. Before we have another speaker, I want to ask one question. Which you want to comment? Sorry, go.
Can I just respond? Is it? Yes. Oh, okay, good. I loved your story because it happened to me. Well, not exactly, but one of my best friends is Jewish, and she invited me when I was in college to go to her brother's bar mitzvah. And I went, and I was just transfixed by the ceremony, the everything. I just said, we don't have any Catholics who can do that. Really. I mean, I was I was just in awe of the tradition of everything about the synagogue. It was in Cleveland, in Lyndhurst. I have to say that I then went to her a bat mitzvah. I went to her sister's wedding and her wedding. And I agree with you. The best thing in the world is to go to each other's services, because then you see, at her bat mitzvah, I came in a little bit late. I mean, it hadn't started yet, but I noticed that everybody was sitting at the end of the pews. And I said, why are they doing that? Why won't they let me in? They were all sitting at the end of the pews. And I thought, oh, that's so, but it was because of the traditions that they bring, the shawl around, and then the various people touch and, and reverence it. It was the most moving, kind of thing. And I will tell you that I definitely, I cannot tell anybody how important it is to go to different services. It is the thing. The other piece is...
Let me ask you a question first.
Oh, okay.
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 Go.
Just one more thing about Kent State. I love teaching at Kent State. And the reason I love it is the diversity. And there are groups about the Palestinian movement. There are groups that are Hillel. And there are groups that are right to life, Catholic, and, right. And I think that the most important thing is that they're compassionate and kind to each other and respectful and listening. And I hope we have a president who constantly tells students to be kind. We have this thing, flashes take care of flashes. And it's because that's so important to do. It transcends it all.
I got to ask a question to the panel because I want to get back to the highlight of the program, which was James Pash talked about the dramatic increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the last 5 years. In the last few months, we've seen an athlete, an entertainer, a politician make statements that I thought I would never hear, as direct as they came. Any of our panelists want to talk about what has happened that has raised the elevation of anti-Semitism in the last 3 to 5 years? Can anybody either explain it, rationalize it, or tell me how it happened? Anybody?
Yes.
Give me more than 2 minutes.
Well, I think it's tied very much into the rise in white supremacy and the permission giving if you have not read it and you're interested in this topic, you must read Jesus and John Wayne. It helps you to understand what the early sort of foundation is for building toward the America we're now living in. And I think it touches on so many relevant issues in society, in this society. So I think it's directly tied into white nationalism and also into the populism we saw recently growing, not only in this country, but around the world, and white supremacy. I mean, it's just, for me, that's a very clear connection, and it's the kind of cowboy-esque behaviors that are now given credence. I also want to say this. I think that we have failed as quote-unquote liberal people, or anywhere on the spectrum. We only have words, right? But anywhere on the spectrum that isn't like that conservative right-wing that we're talking about right now. I think we have utterly failed because we've had a very, and to your point, it's wonderful when we can coexist, when we can embrace our diversity, but we can't fall off the wagon on the live and let live, right? Not all statements are equally valid. not all points of view are equally valid. You do not, freedom of speech does not give you the right to say some of the things we've heard in the public sphere from even the president of this country in recent years. It's unacceptable, and unfortunately we've built up a tolerance for it, and we've had a very sort of, I think, embracing attitude that has been a failure. And so I think America is, we are having lectures like this so that we can take back our morality, in a sense, take back the ethic and what we believe this country stands for. I mean, I think when you were speaking earlier, you were saying, I was thinking, you made me think about, and I just shared, I became a citizen in 2018. This isn't the America I signed up for. I mean, but the America that I read about in the little book that I said yes to, that I went up to Cleveland and signed on for, is the America that I believe all of us in this room would say we want to embrace. Yeah.
Anybody else want to comment? We have one more person. You want to ask a question?
Come on, yes, you. Come right on down.
Or make a comment, either way.
I think we are all quite like-minded here, and to hear all the things that you've said is so very beautiful. What I wonder is, you as a minister and you as a teacher are trying to do what all of us are trying to do in the only way we know how. You are really on a front line we can't approach. What reaction do you get? Do people want to know more about what you're saying to them? Do they accept it? What's the response? And thank you for doing it.
I can speak from college students. We have, a few years ago, we had the Teaching for Tolerance. It's one of the websites that I shared over of the resources. It's now Learning for Justice. And they came to campus, and some of my students really did not understand. They couldn't see how it was relevant, And so there are so many ways that, for me, I try to include it everywhere I can. I make sure that I give them as many social justice issues to consider, and I just think it's just so important. But one of the things that they will tell me sometimes, they will come back after student teaching or during student teaching, and they'll say, a student almost got in a fight in my class, and they didn't know how to handle it. And I always say, never argue with a student, you'll lose. The logic is not on your side. It's on theirs. It really is true. But I always say this, and I say, but never let it go. Always make sure that you are so, that you talk to the students either silently or either by themselves or whatever. I really strongly. But I really share with them as many social justice issues as possible in terms of math education and in terms of anything. I'm so proud of the secondary math education group that we have at Kent State, because we are doing social justice throughout our entire curriculum. I think it's a real necessary piece. So thank you, though.
Any other comments?
I don't believe that I have the right to breathe air and not fight for justice. I don't believe that I have the right to stand as I stand, because my life is built on the blood of those who came before, who laid their lives down. So as I mentioned, I'm a white South African, whole nother topic for a whole nother night. And personally, yeah. I'm not going to, I mean, I was going to say something about apartheid in Israel and Palestine. I don't like its application there, being that I'm a white South African. But anyway, that's a whole nother topic. I will do what I have done, what you charged us to do, and that's never let it go, right? You hear it, you see it, it's an injustice, whether it's racism or sexism or homophobia, name it and say it. But the problem is, if you do that and you break relationship, you don't gain a great deal. And if you do that, you also come up against stereotypes. So, you know, it doesn't behoove me to sound like the angry liberal lady or the railing pastor. People will just discount my voice. So I really have learned, and I've always felt that relationship is the most important thing, and building relationships so that you can have those conversations. The piece that I find most valuable is that oops and ouch thing that we learn, some of us. Maybe you've been in a training. It's not my idea. I don't know where I picked it up. But you know, if you make a mistake, if you say something, because if you're as extroverted and verbal as I am, and Reverend John Beatty, you're going to definitely get yourself in trouble, right? So you've got to be able to say, oops, that didn't match my intention. And if somebody says something around you that hurts either you or someone else, ouch. Ouch. And I think there's a way to, in other words, express that what you said was not okay, but not to get into it and make it that you're not okay. And so I try to build relationship, and I've interacted with people in churches, not my current setting necessarily, where people will say the most fragrantly wrong things, politically incorrect things. But I'm a South African, and we don't mind saying the politically incorrect thing. We really do. You all Americans are very scared of saying the politically incorrect thing. Don't let that be the issue. And also, why should we go around policing each other? You know, I mean, we've got scriptures about that, right? I've got my own stick in my own eye. I don't need to police somebody else, but I do need to say if it hurts, and if it's hurting us as a created people, and if it's hurting our harmony and our unity. So that's where I begin, rather than trying to sort of, quote unquote, preach to anyone, if that helps.
So your question actually reminds me of a discussion that's going on literally today, yesterday, and it's about Dave Chappelle's monologue on Saturday Night Live. Anyone see it? So there are basically, he spent a lot of the time talking about the Kanye West, Kyrie Irving, and anti-Semitism. He said some things I wish he would not have said. He is a comedian, and there are people now up in arms that, you know, he went overboard, and that what he did is even worse because it's a national. And it's like, I think some reflectiveness about how we handle these things. And Jon Stewart, who some of you also probably know of, had an interview with on some other show where he talked about this. And what he said was, you know, it might feel good to like ostracize someone. That's right, the idea of like time out or you know, go to the corner. But you're not going to build any understanding doing that. And what are you really trying to accomplish? And that really resonated with me, because I think, again, there are people who are jumping all over Dave Chappelle. I actually thought most of it was okay and pretty funny. But when we start, I guess, shilling for whatever is said, that is going to get tuned out pretty quickly.
One final comment, and then I'll let everybody go because it's right past time. One comment related to what we just heard. ADL for a long period of time had a program called Teaching Tolerance. The difficulty is tolerant means that you are being tolerant, you're accepting somebody else. They've changed their name to Teaching Religious and Racial Understanding. That is the new phrase they're using, which makes a lot more sense. Thank you all for coming. Let's thank our speakers for this. And I appreciate it. Thank you all. Oh, I'm sorry, Kathy. I forgot to call you. I forgot to call on Kathy. I apologize.
These, tonight, we didn't catch this yet, but it'll be uploaded and it will be put on YouTube. So Akron Area Interfaith Council, go there, and we'll put the links on our website also so that you can watch them again and share them with your friends. So, and come back. We hope to continue, pick up threads and continue the conversation as the year goes on. You can join for about, what is it, $40? I forget. $30, and we can use the help. We're not paid for our positions. We're volunteers, and we desperately need the help. So come on. We always meet the first Tuesday of the month, and just go to our website, and it'll be posted to where, or you can Zoom in. Thank you.
Thank you. Please have a safe evening.
that's the question for people who say it from their roots. What do they? It's fair to ask them. It's scary. I think it's the majority of them. It's exactly what they say. They're taking it over. If they don't need that, they should say something. But I think they do. That's the problem. I don't think they say just because it rhymes.
Well, it says rhyme.
I think they say because they need it. That's ultimately the challenge. For example, the building of the separation of church. What is it? Hundreds and thousands destroying children and people in restaurants and on buses. Hundreds and hundreds. Day after day. So they go to wall so people can go and view and it's not. Now, it's signal of oppression. But it's for a reason, self-defense. And Rome would come down and say, it was safe to do so. I don't know, it's challenging.
It's so easy. It's so easy. To take people's expression and don't see any nuance in it.
Right.
And it's like, no, they're out to kill us all. So we have to. These are questions that we do have to hold sidewalks very high. Another sidewalk next to it, the separation area is very narrow. What is this?
I don't believe that.
Friends who are not Palestinian. These are things that I think a strong minority in Israel is fighting for equal treatment and understanding and peace through justice. There can't be peace without justice. That's what.
Well, there can be peace without stopping bloodshed. There is an active state of war. They're at war. This would be like saying we should treat everybody in Berlin fine and nice in 1943. There was war. When people are trying to kill you, you have to defend yourself.
Yes.
There's an expression, and it goes back decades. It goes back way before.
I think Israel was founded in 1947.
And the meeting was attended.
Yeah.
And succeeding several more times. And continues to be.
But I'm sure you've heard of Ergon. You've heard how Israel was founded out of a violent revolution. Or just like the U.S. was founded out of a violent revolution against the king of Israel. The problem with that
Where
was...
Israel was founded out of revolution against the British.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
There were Jews living in Israel.
Yes, there were. And they were living in relative peace with the Muslims and the Christians. And
because they were a small minority, there was no danger there.
right. And
Because the British ran everything. And,
yeah.
No, it's a challenge, but
It's a big challenge.
but when Palestinians say they are the indigenous people, they're forgetting about 3,000 years of history. It's like saying Pilgrims of the Indigenous People of Massachusetts.
If you let me know, I can.
doing.